agreement has been arrived at on patrolling arrangements along the line of actual control in the India-China border areas, leading to disengagement and a resolution of the issues that had arisen in these areas. This is a multilateral event, though of course there is always a provision for bilateral meetings on the sidelines. We are currently looking into the overall program of the Prime Minister. There are a number of requests for bilateral meetings, and we will update you on the bilaterals as they evolve as soon as feasible.
All right, a patrolling arrangement has been arrived at which has led to disengagement in all the areas of friction along the line of actual control between India and China. So what were these areas of friction? Remember, it was China that tried to unilaterally change the status quo. There were 7 points of friction. The most important was the Pangong Tso Lake, which of course India had to engage in a military operation, occupy the Kailash ranges, and then as some kind of a who will blink first situation, the Chinese vacated Pangong Tso. Then there was Gogra, where again disengagement has been done. Right next to it there is the hot springs as well. In both of those places, Gogra and hot springs, you had the disengagement happen a little while earlier. In Galwan Valley, where it started back in June of 2020, when 20 Indian soldiers died, when Chinese PLA engaged with them, it was a bare knuckle fight. There were knives used, and 20 Indian soldiers died. Disengagement has happened in Galwan Valley as well. The two areas that were the holdouts were the Dapsang Plains, because it's flat land. Whoever has control over there has visibility, and that's an important one. India was concerned it would give direct visibility all the way up to the Daulat Beg Oldie airstrip, as it were. And then, of course, there was the Demchok area as well. So these were the two last remaining holdout areas, Demchok and Dapsang. And today you heard from both the Foreign Secretary and the Foreign Minister saying that disengagement has happened at all the friction points, which means, as the Foreign Minister said, that we're going back to the pre-2020 status quo as it existed just before Galwan happened. Let's now open this up to our guest. This is a huge development because it's taken a very long time. These last 4 years were easily the worst in terms of bilateral ties between Beijing and New Delhi, certainly since the 1993 and 1996 agreements were signed. So what has brought about this thaw? Will this lead to a bilateral meeting on the sidelines of the Brics summit in Kazan? And more importantly, this patrolling arrangement, how will this play out on the ground? Let's now open this up to our guest. Professor Brahma Chalani, strategic affairs expert, is joining us. Professor Victor Gao is president for the Center for China and Globalization. Lieutenant General retired Rakesh Sharma is former Adjutant General and former GOC of the 14 Corps. The 14 Corps playing a very key role in the negotiations with the Chinese. And Kamal Sibal is former Foreign Secretary to the Government of India. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us. Let me start off with Professor Chalani. This is what the Foreign Minister said, that he said, now we're back to the 2020 position, the status quo as it existed in 2020. Disengagement with China is complete. These were the areas that were blocked by both sides since 2020. We can now patrol like in 2020. What is your best understanding of what has been agreed between both sides?
I'm afraid this entire arrangement has been done to facilitate a meeting between Modi and Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the Brics summit. But let's understand the background to this crisis. The present crisis resulted from China's open violation of bilateral border management agreements, including on patrolling. These were formal agreements whose texts were made public. Yet China violated them openly, including by encroaching on Indian territories and massing large numbers of forces along the entire LAC. Now a new patrolling arrangement has been announced. This is not a formal agreement, but an understanding reached in talks. So how significant is such an arrangement? will the new patrolling arrangement last until China violates it too? But more fundamentally, to end the military standoff, which is now in its fifth year, three steps are needed: disengagement, de-escalation, and de-induction of rival forces. The new patrolling arrangement only relates to the first step, disengagement of rival forces. And no details have been released in the public domain about this new patrolling arrangement. The second and third steps, de-escalation and de-induction of rival forces, would be difficult, in part because of the new warfare-related infrastructure that China has built along the entire India frontier. This is permanent infrastructure, so it will remain in place. India thus would not be able to lower its guard. As you know, China has bored tunnels and shafts into mountainsides to set up an elaborate underground military infrastructure as they're preparing for war. In addition, it has planted settlers in new militarized border villages. So, simply put, the new military realities China has created along the LAC will continue to pose a significant threat to India. So, two things will not change. One, with China having forcibly changed the territorial status quo in eastern Ladakh, a return to status quo ante is most unlikely. Second, the Indo-Tibetan frontier is set to remain more or less a hot border given the new facts on the ground that China has created. This underscores the enduring nature of the military threat posed by China to India.
So let me ask Foreign Secretary Kanwal Sibal two things that we need to know. A, what has brought about this disengagement? B, if there is a new patrolling arrangement, as Professor Chalani was saying, A, we need to know what this new patrolling arrangement is. B, that's not essentially solving the problem, because he says that the status quo has already been changed. China has built permanent structures along these disputed parts of the LAC, and that, according to him, has changed the very nature of the conflict itself. It is now a hot border. It was never a hot border, at least from 93 onwards, once those confidence building measures were signed. And most importantly, he's saying this whole thing has been done in time for a possible bilateral meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the Brics summit in Kazan.
Well, I think Brahma is not wrong in being a little skeptical about this because of our experience with China in the past. However, without knowing the full details and basing ourselves on what has been stated, I would say that when the Foreign Minister himself and the Foreign Secretary say that we have agreed to go back to the previous patrolling rights and there will be disengagement, this has to be taken seriously. Because after having made these public statements, and the details will come out shortly, then the public will be able to judge whether this was exaggeration or whether it was a reality. Therefore, I don't think the government can take the risk of making statements like this, knowing that in due course they'll have to give the full details. Therefore, I would like to give the benefit of the doubt to the government. I think there has been an agreement. I think China has recognized that India's position, repeated time and again by the foreign minister, there cannot be normality in ties unless there is normality on the borders, has finally registered on the Chinese. And in their own calculations, they may also want that there should now be a degree of a disengagement and the beginning of an India-China dialogue. And Brahma is right that this has been done because the Brics summit has given the push to this. And both sides, therefore, have realized this was an opportunity to have a conversation, which will have very major echo internationally. So given that let me complete. Such a stalemate in our relations for so many years, and this is in the context of our relations with the West and Indo-Pacific and Quad and everything else. So a lot of meaning will be read into this. So the only little thing that has caused me a little puzzled me a little bit is that the foreign minister has said that we are going back to the situation that existed before 2020. But Depsang and Demchok are prior to 2020. So there is a little confusion there. But maybe when they give the details, we will know what the position is. This also means that in the buffer zone, patrolling will be resumed, which is important.
So let me ask Professor Victor Gao, we are still awaiting the details of what is the nature of the patrolling. We're also awaiting the details of how the disengagement happened in the two last remaining holdouts, which were Depsang and Demchok. But as we await those details, the big picture is that for the last 5 years, India and China have not had a bilateral at the highest level, at the level of the two principals. For the last 4 years, this is not a normal relationship. As the External Affairs Minister said time and time again, this is not a normal relationship. And you cannot go back to normal until you fix the border. Is this a sign that we are returning to normal? And to that extent, India held out for 4 years saying that you cannot unilaterally change the status quo. So are we to believe, Professor Gao, that China has finally relented and said, okay, we'll go back to the arrangement that served us well for 30 years. We will go back to how it existed prior to June of 2020.
Thank you very much for having me. First of all, let us congratulate the Chinese government and the Indian government for having reached this agreement, which in itself is a very important one, because for China and India, the two largest populations in the world, each having population larger than 1.4 billion people, for us to be kind of distracted by the border dispute is a shame for both countries. We need to really promote cooperation between these two countries, especially because both China and India are important members of the Brics organization, and each of us have huge responsibility for domestic economic development, lifting people out of poverty, and China has already achieved that in 2020. India still has a long way to go in achieving this end. So for the two countries to agree how to better management the patrol exercise going forward is absolutely the right thing and a very important development. Now, allow me to mention one thing. I understand over the past 4 or 5 years, there was one big country which wants to urge China and India to be more contentious against each other. Whereas there is another big country, Russia, which has made the point to both China and India that for whatever reason, China and India should have the courage and the wisdom to overcome the problems. And I think the latter, a big country, was doing the right thing, and the former big country was doing the wrong thing.
But Professor Gao, here the contention is that you are giving too much credit to what you have just said are the machinations of the United States, and too much to the peace brokering efforts by Russia. Ultimately, the reason why the situation was abnormal between China and India was because China decided to unilaterally attack Indian soldiers in Galwan. 20 Indian soldiers died. And there were these 7 friction points where China unilaterally disregarded long-held military agreements from 1993 and 1996, unilaterally disregarded that and changed the status quo. And no matter, big power, persuasion or machination is not going to change that reality. Today, if we are saying that we're going back to pre-2020, then it means that the reality on the ground has gone back to pre-2020. It's not going to go back because America said so or Russia nudged both countries to do so.
Now, first of all, between China and India, we should have enough capabilities to solve whatever problems there are between the two of us. However, if India is played by another big country, that may change the equilibrium. And if another country, Russia, wants to play a different role, of course it will be helpful if you have the peace of mind to look at this kind of more conciliatory tone played by the role of Russia. Now, aside from that, allow me to mention, in due respect to all the Indian panelists, and including you, I think your representation and the Chinese position are seemingly in parallel universe. Because from the Chinese perspective, it is the Indian forces on the ground which have kept pushing beyond the line of actual control, setting up camps, setting up permanent structures, for example, forcing China to take action to retaliate against
That is
such
not true. That is not
encroaches
true.
by the Indian side.
I am hearing for the first time that you're saying, or you're characterizing what happened in June 2020 as some kind of a retaliation. There was no attack from the Indian side in 2020 for any kind of retaliation. But let me ask Lieutenant General Rakesh Sharma, because he was closely involved in some of these negotiations as well when it initially started. Today, when you have the Foreign Minister and the Foreign Secretary saying that a patrolling arrangement has been arrived at and that has led to disengagement in all friction points, what is your best understanding, sir, of how this agreement has been arrived at? And B, what does this mean? Are we now back to pre-April or May 2020 position?
Thank you, Zaka, for inviting me. Firstly, I wish to say that this is a positive development. We are civilizational countries. We must sit down together and we must decide issues which are even stuck over long periods of history and say how to sort it out. And having put that back, what has happened today, the fine print is not available. It requires a little analysis, a little more deeper analysis than what we can do today. What the foreign minister has said rightly, that the disengagement process is completed and situation has gone back to 2020. Now, it seems to be a modus vivendi to diffuse the situation to some end that we can achieve, as rightly pointed out by previous speakers, for the meeting that ought to take place tomorrow or day after in Russia. But having said that, there are large number of issues which are not as yet clear. What happens to the buffers? Will the buffers go away? Will the patrolling be allowed to? See, I am not very fond of friction point issue, but the fact is that there is a large area which was denied for patrolling to us in 2020, and 2020 didn't happen in 2020. It was started over a period of 10 years. So the CBMs that were created from 1993 onwards were failing for a period of time till it came to 2020 where they collapsed. So the point that I wish to raise is that today, as we talk about some kind of a modus vivendi has been arrived at, we'll have to see what are the protocols formed for it. And do we trust those protocols? Because the trust factor is the first issue which actually died on 2020 totally, on the border, I'm saying. But it actually started dying a period earlier, maybe by 2008, 2009, the process of scuffles and fisticuffs had started. So this is a long drawn process.
General Sharma can correct me if I'm wrong. I think Dipsang, the first time a flare-up happened was in 2013, right before the then Chinese Premier Li Keqiang's visit. Demchok, similarly, I think the first time it flared up was in 2014, just before Xi Jinping's visit, after Prime Minister Modi was elected for his first term in 2014.
I would like to link the visits to the
that was not the point I was making. I was saying, Dipsang and Demchok were much before 2020. Yeah, you're right.
Yes, and also that the fisticuffs and scuffles that started by 2008, 2009, they were not quantified as failing CBMs, but actually the CBMs were failing for a period of time till it came to 2020. How do we arrive at a balance between distrust and confidence building measures that we arrive at today?
So let me just rephrase that question, General Sharma. So you are saying that even if we, as the Foreign Minister said, even if we are now back to the 2020 arrangement, which is that you can patrol up to finger point 8, the Chinese come up to finger point, I think it was 2, if I'm not mistaken, if my memory serves me right. That's the arrangement that we have gone back to. Your contention is because the trust factor is so low and there is such a high trust deficit, you are saying fundamentally this won't work on the ground until we go back and relook at the 1993 and 1996 agreements and both sides sign off on a renewed 93 and 96 agreement. Is that your contention?
So I am not saying that it is not going to succeed. I'm just saying that we have to develop methodologies that will suit the present day environment where we do not create situations that go back to 2013, 14, 17, all this period of time and 2020. So, it is not one day's effort. It's a small step, sure, positive step forward today. But to actually achieve a total kind of peace on the borders will take a little time and it will take a little effort.
Let me go back to to Professor Chalani and to Secretary Sibal. Professor Chalani, paint the international context in which this has happened. I take half a point of what Mr. Gao has said, that look, let's be realistic about this. This will be watched very closely in Washington, in London, in Ottawa, in Canberra. Because let's face it, there's so much of public noise around the Khalistan issue and the frictions between India and Canada, and also, India and America not being on the same page on this issue, at least on this one narrow issue. Is the background to which this deal has happened. So, and particularly as Mr. Gao said, Russia seemingly was trying to play sort of honest peace broker or mediator between Beijing and New Delhi. Whether or not that was what clinched the deal, we'll come to that. But the fact is that this will be viewed with a lot of trepidation and suspicion in places like Washington, Ottawa, London, etc.
You're right, Zaka. China and India are two ancient civilizations that make up more than a third of the global population. So it makes sense for China and India to try and promote peaceful cooperation and peaceful coexistence. The problem is the CCP's expansionist impulse. That has been at the root of the crisis. We are mentioning 2020 without identifying the trigger for the ongoing military standoff. The trigger was not the Galwan military clash. That was a consequence of what happened in April 2020, which is when the PLA furtively came and encroached upon Indian territories in Ladakh. That was the trigger for the standoff. Xi Jinping miscalculated that he would be able to present the land grabs as a fait accompli to India. But India mounted a robust military response by matching Chinese military deployments. Now, one other important thing that we should keep in mind is that 3 major buffer zones were created. These were in Galwan Valley, Pangong So, and Gogra Hot Springs. Now, these buffer zones came up largely on Indian territory that India had patrolled until 2020. No details were released about these agreements on the buffer zones because of this reality that they were largely set up on Indian territory. 26 of the 65 patrolling points in eastern Ladakh, India lost access to these patrolling points. Now, no details have been released about this so-called new patrolling arrangement. I doubt very much whether we will see real details about this new patrolling arrangement, because it is certainly not a return to status quo ante. It is more likely a repeat of the pattern of the kind of buffer zones that we saw being set up in Galwan Valley, Pangong So, and Gogra Hot Springs.
So let me ask Secretary Sibal, one of the other sort of relative points of reference has been what happened in Doklam in 2017. And at that time, again, it went on for, I think, almost a month, that standoff between Indian and Chinese troops. Of course, this was on Bhutanese territory. And then finally, the Chinese backed off. But a few years down the line, Bhutan and China were in active engagement, in active dialogue to resolve that issue. And frankly, there was concern in South Bloc whether India's interests were being taken on board. What is the worry? What is the fear that something similar might happen again in this instance, where right now they're saying, okay, we're going back to the 2020 position, but who's to know? Next year, China might have a different frame of mind. Maybe they will try their adventures somewhere else, maybe in Arunachal Pradesh.
My information is that we are not being overly ambitious. We will take it one step at a time. At the moment, the objective is disengagement and resumption of patrolling. Now, when our foreign minister and our foreign secretary say that patrolling will be resumed, then if in actual fact patrolling is not resumed, then there will be a huge embarrassment. And it's not as if in our system we'll be able to paper over this and keep it confidential. Therefore, I would incline to believe what they're saying in terms of resumption of patrolling, which means in the buffer zones, they will return to the patrolling as before. With regard to Demsang and Demchok, my understanding is they are also covered, but I don't know, because I was a bit puzzled by the foreign minister's statement that we're going back to 2020. And as I said, these are the two areas predate 2020. That is the second point. The third point is that we are not at the moment thinking of either de-escalation or de-induction. we will have some, as I understand, some new protocols with regard to how to manage the border.
Okay.
And it doesn't mean that 1993, 96 and other arrangements will be put aside, but maybe some additional protocols to ensure that the kind of things that occurred after 2020 do not occur again. And then when confidence builds up and there is better communication and there is little more trust, they can go to the next phase of kind of de-escalation. I don't think we are in a hurry to de-escalate for the simple reason that we don't trust what the Chinese may do unexpectedly, as we've experienced in the past. So it will be a drawn-out process. And finally, it's a good thing that Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi will meet, because it has certain very important diplomatic implications for our relations with a variety of countries and our foreign policy postures on foreign policy. This can give us some dividends, and some small agreements will take place. Some low-hanging fruit, I think, will be
Professor Gao, I'll give the final word. I need to wrap up after this. But the moot point is that China has bitten off more than it can chew. It has ongoing territorial disputes with Japan, South Korea. There is, of course, Taiwan. All of the stuff that's happening in the South China Sea. There are boats literally colliding every week off the coast of the Philippines. China has realized that it can't open so many fronts, and therefore, if there is a front vis-a-vis India where it can quietly, tone down the temperature, then so be it. And maybe you're right. Maybe it's come at a little bit of nudge and wink from our friends in Moscow.
Now, allow me to mention one thing. China definitely wants to have good relations with India. We highly admire the Indian people, your civilization, etc. So I think both China and India need to work very hard to put these territorial disputes behind us, rather than being hijacked by these disputes. Now, secondly, for sure, China has altogether 14 land neighboring countries. China signed a land border treaty with 12 of them. Only India and Bhutan have not yet signed border treaties with China. And you mentioned Bhutan. China and Bhutan seem to be very eager to move forward to solve all their territorial disputes. Okay. If they can do that, why should that be a detriment to India? India should welcome China and Bhutan.
But India has legitimate security concerns around that area, which is disputed between Bhutan and China. That's why India should be concerned, and India has legitimate stakes there. I mean, if nothing else, it's incumbent upon the Indian army to provide protection to Bhutanese sovereignty, as we saw in 2017 in Doklam. We'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Like I said, the details are still not been made public. I guess we'll get to know when that meeting happens. It's very likely that there will be a standalone sort of meeting bilateral between Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi on the sidelines of the Brics summit in Kazan. So 2 weeks to go for the U.S. presidential elections, and the race between Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump remains seemingly a dead heat. A string of surveys recently, as of the third week of October, showing that Harris has a narrow, less than a 1% advantage over Trump, even though in the key battleground states, she seems to be a notch behind. Harris has managed to, of course, ever since her candidacy was announced back in July, when President Joe Biden pulled out of the Democratic nomination, she managed to sort of build up a lead through much of August and September. But over the last 3 weeks or so, Donald Trump has managed to narrow the gap quite significantly, to the point today where if an election were to be held today, it'll virtually be a dead heat. Less than 1% separates Trump and Harris. Can Trump, who famously outsmarted and outwitted and outwon Hillary Clinton back in 2016, can he do that again? Can he script a come-from-behind victory yet again, this time in 2024? Let's try and find out from the man who is pitched as the Nostradamus of predicting U.S. elections. I call him the Oracle of American elections. Professor Alan Lichtman from the American University is now joining us. Thank you very much, Professor, for speaking with us. Good to see you as always. When we spoke last, I think it was in August, and you had just come out with your announcement with the keys, and you said in 2024 your prediction was that Kamala Harris would win the 2024 election. Are you sticking to your prediction, particularly given how the gap seems to be narrowing, particularly in the last few weeks? It seems like Kamala Harris is finding it much tougher today than when you made your prediction back in August.
My prediction has nothing to do with the polls. That's the mistake a lot of people make. You can take those polls and do with them what the great British philosopher David Hume said you should do to works of superstition, consign them to the flames. They're all noise because the error margin is vastly greater than the pollsters would tell you. They tell you, you've heard this, it's plus and minus 3%, right? That's pure statistical error. That's the error you would get if you had a huge jar of green and red balls and you pulled out a sample to estimate the percentage of green and red balls in the jar. But human beings are not green and red balls. They don't respond to pollsters. They may lie. The election is not held today. They're going to change their minds. And the pollsters have no idea who's actually going to vote. They have to guess at the likely voters. That at least doubles the error margin to at least plus and minus 6%, which is a 12-point gap. It has to be 12 points or more. And that additional error is not random. In 2016, the polls underestimated Republican voting strength, which is why, in defiance of the polls, I predicted Trump's win, even got a letter of congratulations from him after that prediction. But based on what we've seen in 2022 to 2024, the polls are now underestimating Democratic voting strength. Look, I know the media has to slavishly follow the polls. You have to tell a story every single day. You got to make believe the election is a horse race with the pollsters keeping score. But my system transcends all that. It's based upon the presumption that elections are driven by the strength and performance of the White House party. That's why I introduced my prediction before the so-called Harris-Trump pivotal debate that the pundits were talking about.
Yeah. But tell me this, Professor, you base your predictions not on any of these polls, but the answers to your 13 true or false questions, or keys as you call them, the 13 keys to the White House. And you've recently even got into a bit of a scruff with some traditional pollsters, the likes of Nate Silver, etc., who you have called a compiler of polls, a clerk. Why would you say that your model is better than that of, so many political scientists, data crunchers, the likes of Nate Silver, and there's millions of dollars backing the polling industry?
Simple reason, track record. I've been right for 42 years since I predicted Ronald Reagan's re-election in April 1982, nearly 3 years ahead of time when 60% of Americans said he was too old to run again, and his approval ratings were down in the dumps. I defied all the pollsters, all the pundits in predicting Donald Trump in 2016. Remember what Nate Silver told us? Depending on the time of day you checked in with him, he said there was, a 70 to 80% chance Hillary Clinton would win the election. Then when she lost, he said, see, I told you there was a 20% plus chance that she would lose. If you can't be wrong, you also can't be right. My predictions are definitive. I tell you who's going to win or lose. My predictions are totally nonpartisan. I've predicted the two most conservative presidents of our time, Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump, and liberals like Barack Obama. Can I be wrong? Of course. I'm a human being. Any human being can be wrong, although no one has a 42-year track record. Maybe we've just outlived everyone else. My predictions are based on also 160 years of historical patterns. Retrospectively in development, I've gone all the way back to 1860, when we had no radio, no television, no automobiles, no planes, no polls. Women couldn't vote. African Americans were enslaved. We were an agricultural society. So the polls have survived enormous changes in our, the keys, enormous changes.
Wouldn't you be concerned because you predicted a Harris win, and by consequence of that, wouldn't the Harris campaign be worried that she doesn't seem to be the candidate who has momentum, particularly in these last 3 weeks leading up to the polls? She had a much wider gap back in September and in August than she has now. it's almost like it's a come from behind sort of strategy for Donald Trump. Does that not concern? Because in a contest where you're going all in towards November 5th, if the perception is, and she's had a bunch of missteps. I mean, the Fox News interview last week, not going to the Catholic dinner in memory of Al Smith, her going to Michigan, to Detroit, and giving a speech for 6.5 minutes. It doesn't seem like, you know, she's making the right steps or the right moves.
You know, if Trump wins, and as I said, I can be wrong, but I explain why I don't follow the polls. Journalists like you are going to have to look really hard in the mirror. You're talking about the most minor matters. Oh, you know, I didn't do as well as I could have in this interview. I didn't go to this dinner. Absolutely insignificant. Whereas Donald Trump has made it crystal clear that if he wins this election, he is going to govern as an authoritarian. He is going to go on a revenge campaign against anyone he doesn't like. He is going to put his thumb on all the independent agencies of government. And our democracy may well die because he's being protected by a Supreme Court decision. How is it that you focus on these minor, insignificant things from Harris and don't focus on the fact that our democracy may well die if Trump wins? And he's made that crystal clear time and again, plus his incredible cognitive diminishment. You know, the press was all over Biden for faltering in the debate. How about Donald Trump spending 12 minutes talking about Arnold Palmer in the shower? Can you imagine that? Stopping questioning and spending 39 minutes, you know, trying to sway to the music, you know, confusing people's names, getting everything wrong. You know, you guys in the press are my buddies, but boy, oh boy, have you missed the boat big time here.
So, but tell me this. These are important issues, and no one is underplaying or denying the importance of those issues, whether it is Trump's seemingly cognitive decline, whether it is him putting democracy on the ticket, as the Democrats are alleging, and so on and so forth. But ultimately, most elections, and this is, I think, 2 out of your 13 keys, are on the state of the economy. Most Americans...
Only 2 keys, you're right.
Most Americans feel like they are worse off economically today than they were 4 years ago.
Look, based on the economy, Hillary Clinton should have won in a landslide in 2016. The economy was doing incredibly well. Based on the economy, Hubert Humphrey in 1968 should have won in a landslide. It was the best economy we've ever had. That's just 2 keys out of 13. You can't just isolate 2 of the keys. If you want to develop your own political system just based on polling on the economy, go right ahead. I get this all the time. But I have never seen a system that's successful actually in doing that. And again, you haven't responded to my critical point, which is you have vastly underplayed the danger that Trump poses to our future democracy.
But explain this to me. Explain this to me as to why you think that is the number one issue concerning ordinary Americans in this election.
If it isn't, the press has tremendous amount to blame. You're going to need to look in the mirror if Trump wins, because you're not going to have a free press anymore. Remember, his model is Hungary, where there is no free press and no free opposition. You're going to have to look long and hard in the mirror and explain why you failed to really, in incredibly important ways, point out the danger that Trump poses. You spent way more time, energy, and effort on Biden's faltering debate than on Trump's existential threat to the future of our society.
Let me come down to the brass tacks. The show is called Brass Tacks, and that is ultimately the winner of the Electoral College, not the popular vote. The winner of the Electoral College wins the presidency, and that boils down to about half a dozen states. Again, what we are seeing is in the so-called blue wall states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, which is a must-win for Harris, her leads were much more a month ago or 2 months ago than it is now. I mean, Hillary Clinton lost all of those 3 states going in with a 3.5–4% lead on election day. So why do you believe that Harris will do better than Hillary Clinton 8 years ago in those 3 states because she needs those 3 states to win. She wins those 3 states, she gets the White House.
You're making the same mistake you made in 2016, going with the polls. At that time, going with the polls, the most eminent compiler of polls was not Nate Silver. It was the Princeton University Consortium, one of the world's leading universities, headed by the eminent Professor Sam Wang. And they gave Clinton a 99% chance of winning the election based on the polls. And Wang said, I'm so confident I'll eat a bug on national television if I'm wrong. And indeed, he did that, to his credit. So you can keep talking about the polls, but the polls have nothing to do with the keys to the White House. And as I said, the error margin is so great that these very close polls, as in 2016, one way or the other mean nothing. I explained in 2016 they were underestimating Republican voting strength because of the non-statistical unidirectional error. Now they're underestimating Democratic voting strength. So if you want to make predictions like Nate Silver, go right ahead. But that's not, let me finish. That's not what my model does. It transcends all that.
Why do you say, and explain this to us in layman terms for our viewers watching, why do you say the Democratic voting strength is being underestimated in the polls this election cycle?
Because that's exactly what's happened in every election in 2022. They were predicting this great red wave that absolutely fizzled. In the off-year elections of 2023, the Democrats did way better than expected. And look at the marquee special election of 2024, the New York State congressional election for the seat previously held by the disgraced, expelled George Santos, a swing district previously won by a Republican. A poll taken right at the eve of the election had it as a dead heat. Democrat ahead by an insignificant 1 point. The Democrat won by 8 points, outperforming the poll by 7 points. And that was not a typical. So you can't presume that the polls aren't biased one way or the other.
Why then, Professor, are we seeing, down the ticket races for Senate seats or congressional seats, many of these folks don't want to be seen campaigning with Kamala Harris? Do you not think that they do this? I mean, who would not want to be seen as campaigning in a joint rally with a presidential candidate? The reason they're not doing it, Bob Casey in Pennsylvania, for example.
I'm not sure which candidates you're talking about, but, again, that's not predictive of anything. You can point to all kinds of individual things, and that's the fallacy of predicting by punditry without having a track record and a scientific basis. You could say she's way outraised Donald Trump and way outraised Donald Trump in her fundraising, in small donations. He has these billionaires like Elon Musk, but he's got no traction among ordinary voters. You can say, sure, that's going to predict a Harris victory. You could pull any individual thing out you want, and that's the fallacy of punditry, and that's why the pundits are so often wrong. Not just in 2016. In 2012, after Obama's disastrous first debate against Mitt Romney in October, when the polls turned against him, the pundits were writing him off. I stuck to my prediction of an Obama win. I was right. In 1988, in May, the election year, George H.W. Bush fell 17 points behind his opponent, Mike Dukakis. Pundits and pollsters again wrote him off, saying no one has ever come back from that kind of deficit. I stuck with my prediction that H.W. Bush would win, and I was right. I told you I predicted Ronald Reagan in 1982 when he was down in the dumps in the polls, and 60% of Americans said he was too old to run again.
Okay, so final part of the interview as we come to the conclusion. Sure. I'm going to read out your 13 keys for true or false, and then we're going to see, if anything has changed between August, when you made your first prediction for Kamala Harris.
No, I made my prediction. Let me correct you there. I made my prediction September 5th in the New York Times. I don't know if you've seen the video, but you should check it out.
All right.
I did not make it in August.
So here are your keys. Key number
Sure.
1, incumbent party mandate. So is that a yes or a no for Harris?
No.
Number 2, nomination contest. There is no serious contest for the incumbent party nomination. Is that
That's
a
a
yes?
yes.
That's a yes. So that's one key. Incumbency, the incumbent party candidate is the sitting president. That's a no.
No.
All right. The third party, there are no significant third party or independent campaigns. We did see RFK Jr., but he's now supporting Trump. You don't think that's going to make a difference?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
He's down around 1 or 2%, and just because he's supporting Trump is meaningless, and that's not the definition of the key. I've got to say, every single day, I get a host of emails of people saying they know better how to define my keys than I do. But my keys, if you want to use my system, you've got to stick to keys that have stood the test of time for 160 years. If you want to talk about some other way of looking at elections, I welcome it. I encourage it. But if you're going to use my system, you got to stick to how I define the keys. And by the way, none of these critics ever developed their own
So
system.
let me run through the rest of them. Short-term economy, long-term economy. Both yes for Harris?
Yes.
Policy change, social unrest, and scandal.
Yes.
All three of them.
Yes.
Foreign or military failure, foreign or military success.
Split, a no and a yes.
And then incumbent charisma and challenger charisma.
Incumbent charisma is a no. Challenger charisma is a yes.
So how many keys are a yes? And you say you have to get more than 7 to win?
It's 9-4.
It's 9-4. So Harris gets 9 keys, and therefore, as per the Alan Lichtman keys to the White House, she wins the White House. Okay.
That's my prediction. Can I be wrong? Of course. There can be such cataclysmic and unprecedented changes that can overturn 160 years pattern of history. I'm not psychic Gene Dixon with a crystal ball. I'm not Speaker Mike Johnson, who thinks the Almighty speaks to him. The problem is you can't know in advance whether the pattern that's held since the mid-19th century is going to change.
We will speak to you hopefully on the 6th of November, the day after the election, and see if the Alan Lichtman 13 keys to the White House still hold true, and whether your prediction of Kamala Harris winning the White House does indeed come true. Thank you very much in the meanwhile for joining us, Professor.
Thank you. Great interview. Take care.
Murthy sir.
Well, 24 hours have gone by and the person who had placed the bomb over here has still not been identified by the Delhi police. I'll just try and show you around in the visuals over here, the area in which the bomb blast happened. This is the area where the bomb blast happened, and if you look around from this entire area, on the other side are the eateries that are lined up over here, as you have been mentioning. Now all these shops are closed at this very point. Now remember, the impact was, this entire blast was such that there are broken windows that can be seen on the other side of the road as well. Now what Delhi police sources are telling us, that in the investigation that they have done, or through the CCTV footage that they have been able to go through at this point in time, 3 people can be seen as suspects or have been identified as people of interest. One of them was a person who was seen at this very spot on Saturday night at approximately 10:30-11 p.m. in the night. He was seen at this very spot, he waited at this spot and then went away from here. That person has not been identified at this point in time. Apart from that, 2 other people who were also seen in and around this entire area having suspicious movement. Now in the CCTV footages that have been gone through by the Delhi police at this point in time, these 3 people are being said as the persons of interest. However, the identification of either of these 3 people have still not happened, and the person or the perpetrator of this entire crime has still not been identified by the Delhi police. Once the investigation was taken over by the Delhi police, or started by Delhi police yesterday, there was one person who was initially interrogated by them, and then eventually he was allowed to let go of as well. So definitely at this point in time, there is no substantial evidence that the Delhi police, or for that matter any other agency, be it the N18G or the CRPF, have been able to pinpoint as to who could be the person who might be behind this attack. Yes, there are different theories that are being looked into at this point in time as to what could be the reason for using a bomb which had actually such a high radius of impact that shops which are approximately 20 to 30 meters away from this spot, they have been impacted. But interestingly, in these bombs there were no sharp objects, no shrapnels, no broken glass material that was put over here, because generally in bombs or IEDs that are used, such materials are being put into the bomb so that the entire bomb becomes more potent, so that once the explosion happens, then these objects, shrapnels and other things could actually go ahead and hurt people, and the impact of that blast could increase. But interestingly, in this explosion, there has been no sort of shrapnels or any other sharp objects that have been used. So was this entire blast done just to give some sort of a message, is something that is being investigated. Apart from this, another thing that is being looked into is the Khalistani angle. Remember, one of the channels on Telegram in fact had posted this, that this entire incident has been done by Khalistani supporters, because the manner in which the attacks are happening on Khalistanis across the world, they wanted to give this message that Khalistanis are much closer to the Indian agencies that they expect. Now, if I could just show you over here, just moments ago, a team of CRPF had come over here. Remember, CRPF have this expertise when it comes to looking into IED blast, because they are the people who are operating in places like Dantewada and other places in Chhattisgarh where there is a massive moist impact and there is a lot of IEDs that are being used. So over here there is also, it is being said that IEDs were used, and hence a team of CRPF had come up over here. They have monitored the entire location over here. They have measured the size of impact that the bomb blast has made. Somewhere or the other, they will try to figure out as to what is the quantity of explosives that were used over here, and what kind of explosive was also used over here. Was it a highly technical IED, or was it an IED that could have been made by anyone, is something that the CRPF will come out with. But at this point in time, as the investigation is going ahead, the biggest issue is that the person who had placed the bomb over here has still not been identified, and hence the reason why this blast took place on a Sunday morning at 7:30 a.m. is still not very clear. Well, this entire spot was actually closed by the Delhi police for more than 12 to 13 hours yesterday itself. It is only at approximately 7:30 to 8 p.m. in the evening yesterday that this crime scene was opened and the barricades were removed from this entire area. So during that period of 12 to 13 hours, agencies like CRPF, NSG and the Delhi police, the FSL of the Delhi police, have all visited the spot and have collected evidences from on ground over here. Now the team of CRPF that had come over here, they had just come up over here to measure the impact of this entire crime scene, or the impact of bombs that were used over here. Now, as we were speaking up of the crime scene being opened, police officers have now reached over here. They are trying to get the media away from the crime spot. But yes, as we speak, most of the evidences have already been collected from this entire area. The team of CRPF that had come up over here, they had just come up to measure the impact.
All right, we're down to the home stretch in the U.S. presidential elections, the race to the White House between Donald Trump, the Republican ticket, and Kamala Harris, the Democratic ticket. And it is going right down to the wire. 2 weeks, exactly 2 weeks to the polls. Who stands where? Let's take a look at the average of the Real Clear Politics poll that has just come out. This is as of 20th October 2024. And the gap is absolutely at a hair's breadth. Less than 1% separates Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Kamala Harris at 49.2% and Donald Trump at 48.3%. Like I said, this is less than 1%. It's the closest that the average of the Real Clear polling has been in the last couple of months since Harris's candidature was formally announced at the Democratic Convention. So this is literally on a knife's edge. This could go either way. Just to put that into perspective, the margin of error in most polls in the US is plus or minus 3%. In this case, it is less than 1%, so it could go either way. It could be a Harris presidency or it could be a Trump presidency. But more importantly, it could also be Harris winning the popular vote but losing the Electoral College. The problem for Harris is that her gap, her lead has actually been narrowing when compared to where it was a month ago or 2 months ago. Let's start from August. This was a couple of weeks after Joe Biden withdrew. Joe Biden withdrew on the 21st of July, and then Harris sort of racked up the delegates, the Democratic delegates. The last time Trump led in this tracker of the Real Clear Politics tracker from August to now was on the 4th of August. It was a slender lead that Trump had, less than half a percentage point. Trump at 47.3 and Kamala Harris at 46.9. This was in the first week of August. Then you cut to the third week of August, right after the Democratic National Convention, and then Kamala Harris had what they call a convention bump. So she went into the lead with a gain of 1.5 percentage points, Trump at 46.9 and Kamala Harris at 48.4. This was on the 22nd of August, just the day after the convention concluded, which gave her a what is generally known as a traditional post-convention bump. Then that lead of 1.5 points further increased all through the last week of August, going all the way up to the ABC News debate, the only presidential debate in this election cycle. That happened on the 10th of September. The biggest lead that Kamala Harris has had in these last couple of months is on the 17th of September. She clocked 49.3% and Trump had 47.3%, the gap of 2 percentage points, exactly a week after the ABC News debate. So this is the highest lead that Kamala Harris has had in the last couple of months at 49.3 and 47.3. The problem, look at the two worms. From about the first week of October or so, the Trump worm has been going up, the red worm, whereas the Harris worm has been pretty much flat. So what that means is Trump is the one who's coming from behind. He's the candidate who is seemingly having momentum behind him. He's got tailwind and he's catching up and narrowing the gap. That is not a place where you want to be as a Democratic candidate, where Harris's sort of polling numbers have flattened out around that 49.3% mark, whereas Trump is catching up and he's narrowing the gap.
Viewers, today has been a very, very busy news day. But there's one story that has led to a massive meltdown in the self-proclaimed left-liberal ecosystem. Every paid-up member of this club is bearing fangs at the Chief Justice of India, D.Y. Chandrachud. Their one-time, quote, great liberal hope, unquote, had stunned them by declaring in a speech that he turned to some divine